Most of the time here at White Sage Gardens, I sow everything from seed. Either I sow a seed directly in the ground, or I sow a seed in a flat in the greenhouse and then bring a transplant outside. Today we're going to look at transplanting itself. What is the exact process of taking a little plant out of its container and putting it into its final home in the garden? One of the advantages of having transplants to put out in the early spring is that you can start those plants much earlier in the greenhouse and have a nice big healthy plant to put out earlier. That way you can have a bigger plant sooner in the season. Now in the fall here, what we're doing is planting some winter vegetables that we know are going to grow throughout the winter, but the same principles apply. What you want to do is make sure that your garden bed is completely moist. You don't want to try to transplant into a dry bed. You want to make sure the moisture level is completely up so that when the plant goes into the ground and you water it in, there's plenty of moisture there for that plant to take off and start growing. Also, I'm very careful to only transplant in the late afternoon or when it's a cloudy day. It's a big mistake to try to do any transplanting early in the morning or any time that the sun is going to push the plant to wilting. We've got to remember that a little plant is basically just a little water pump, and the sun is what drives the pump. So we want to take that little plant and put it in the ground in the late afternoon so it has all night to recover from its transplant shock. Plants go through this thing called transplant shock. Every time you disturb its roots and rip it out of a container or one place in the ground and stick it in another place, you've got to be very careful to seal the roots in and make sure that the plant suffers as little transplant shock as possible. That way the plant can recover from its move and start growing really strongly. Now sometimes it's hard to get a plant out of a container. If the plant's grown there for a long time, it's gotten root bound, it's a little bit tricky. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll put my hand on a container and turn it over like that, and then give the bottom cells a little squeeze. And then you should be able to give a little shake, and they should come out in your hand. What I like to do sometimes is take the plants and lay them out in the spacing that I want to have them. Before I actually put them in the ground, I want to see how many I have, especially if I'm planting a bunch of different beds. I want to make sure that I have enough to go around. So if it's not too hot or windy and the plants can be out in the air for a moment, I'll lay them all out to see how the spacings look. Now here's something to look for. If for some reason the roots have all grown together and the plant's gotten a little bit root bound, you don't want to go and plant this little cube right in the ground, because the roots will continue to grow and in a way they can kind of strangle the plant. It's very strange. So what we have to do when we have a little bit of a root bound plant is very gently break apart some of that root mass, try to tease it apart just a little bit. If you break a root or two or three, it doesn't really matter because they're going to grow new ones from that spot. You don't want to rip them apart, but you just want to kind of stretch them apart a little bit. And that way, those roots will be able to recover and start to grow out in the new soil. Now you notice I set the plants offset from each other. That way when they grow really big, they'll be able to occupy the fuller space of the bed. So now I'm going to go ahead and plant these kales at the 18-inch spacing that they really need to be the best they can be. Now you can use any kind of trowel you like. In fact, if you've really done your work well, you should be able to just use your fingers because that soil should be so loose. Those roots should just fly through that soil. You should be able to dig it with your fingers. I like to use a masonry trowel. I don't know why, it just seems to fit in my hand and I like the feel of it. But you can use anything you want really, whatever works. Now when you set the plant in the ground, don't bury it past that little place where the brand new leaf is coming out. You want to make sure that that spot stays above the soil. So what I like to do is dig a little hole, and then I go ahead and put the plant in the hole right to the same level of the same plant surface level here. I make sure is the same level of the bed. And then I go and I push the soil in around the base and give it a firm little nudge. That way the plant is growing at the exact same level as it was in the flat or the container or wherever it came from. I just hold it there against the side and then push the rest of the soil up and around in it. Okay, the kales are now planted. But you plant those kales at 18-inch spacing, there's an awful lot of room left. Often what I like to do with kales or broccoli or cabbage, anything in that family that really needs a big spacing, before that plant has a chance to get full grown, I'll take some lettuce plants and sneak them in between. That way the lettuces can grow to full size, harvest the lettuce out of there just when the kales are needing room to get big. It's called interplanting, and it's a pretty common organic planting technique, and it's a way you can double the efficiency of your bed space and get 2 crops out of the same spot.
All right, rolling.
So right next to these kale plants, I've got some lettuce plants that I direct sowed here a couple of weeks ago. Now they're kind of close together, so what I want to do is take some of those lettuce plants, divide them up, and spread them around in the kales. That way I can have a lettuce crop over here, and any place else I might want to transplant these lettuces throughout the garden. Now when I pull the clumps of lettuce out of this bed, I make sure I leave some space in between so the remaining lettuces have room to grow too. The trick with lettuce transplants is to pick the ones that have the most intact root system. Here's a good example. This transplant's got a nice set of roots here, so it would be able to survive without too much transplant shock. You don't have to dig very big of a hole. Just dig a small enough hole to fit the actual root ball of the plant that you're planting. So we've got our kales planted out and our lettuces interplanted in between them, and now comes the most important part of transplanting, and that's the watering in. You need to take your hose or your watering can and only spray the smallest, gentlest spray you possibly can. You just want to soak in the very surface of the soil. Make sure all the root zone all around the plants get soaked in, and you don't want to let it puddle up. You just want to let it soak in right around the root zone. Now the reason for watering in is not because the plants need a drink of water, but the water settles the soil in around the roots. The roots themselves need to make contact with all the little soil particles because then they can take off in their new growth. The watering action seals in the plant and gets it along on the best start. Now I also go ahead and water some of those lettuces right next door because when I dug some of those up to plant over here, it disturbed a lot of their roots as well. Anytime a plant's in stress or its root zone has been disturbed, I always like to water it in. If it doesn't reassure the plant, it sure does reassure me. All right, if you recall, this is the bed that we worked up during the bed preparation segment, and it's still nice and smooth and ready to get some seeds. The first thing I want to do before I sow seeds into a bed is make sure that it's got plenty of moisture in it. I don't want the bed to be soggy wet, but I don't want it to be powdery dry either. You only want to sow seeds into a nice moist seed bed, because then when we add the moisture from the top, it's just going to settle the seed in nice and gently. The way I mark the rows is with the rake, and I do it by walking backwards with the rake sideways so it pulls a tiny little furrow in the bed. I'm going to make 3 rows of lettuce here in this bed. So I want one that goes right down the middle, and then a row that goes equally on either side of it. Now that one's a little squirrely. I don't like it. You can always do a do-over when you have a good rake. There, much better. Now the actual sowing of the seeds is just like we did in the greenhouse. Sowing the seeds very carefully and slowly, but you want to make sure that there's plenty of seed in the row, but not too much that it's going to be hard to thin. I just take a little pinch between my fingers and sprinkle it in as I go. We're sowing lettuce seeds here. The Lola Rosa, one of my favorite red lettuces. It's pretty hardy all throughout the winter. Now this bed is really wide, but I'm a pretty tall guy, so I can reach the center of it. Because that's our rule of thumb of how wide a bed should be. The smallest person should be able to reach the middle. And this is exactly why.
Well, it's coming really close here, so.
What I'm doing is taking a pinch of seeds in my fingers and just going like that. And if you do that carefully, just a little trickle of seeds will come sprinkling out. So now that we've got the seeds sown in the little furrows, we want to go back and gently rake those furrows closed, covering up those seeds at a very shallow depth.
Stop, stop. After I've raked over each little furrow, I go along and I tamp it very gently to seal that soil right down on top of the seeds. I'm not slamming it very hard, I'm just gently tamping that little mound so all those seeds get sealed inside their furrow. Now once you've sowed your seeds and tamped them in, don't go back and try to rake anything. That would be a big mistake because if you try to rake this now, your rake could catch some of the seeds and pull them out of their furrow. Once the seeds have been sown, you just want to leave them alone and water them in. Once you've got the row nice and smoothly tamped, the next thing to do is to spread a thin layer of cover soil over the whole bed. A thin layer of cover soil will keep the bed moist and allow those seeds to germinate. The last step when you sow some seeds directly into the garden bed is to spread a thin layer of cover soil right on top. I like to use a nicely sifted compost that I've made. So I take a little bit on this spade, hold it over, and give a slight jiggle with my wrist, because we only want a very thin layer to come out. You just kind of want to shake it and get a nice thin layer over the whole entire bed. Okay, we've got our seeds sown, we've got our light cover soil across the top. The very last step is to water it in. Now, just like the transplants, we don't want to have heavy water on this. We want to have the very lightest spray possible, as gentle as a spring rain. That's how I always remembered that even that's too strong. We want a tiny, tiny bit. Because all we really want to do is just moisten that top layer. Because remember, the bed is already moist all the way through. It's plenty wet enough all down inside the bed. All we want to do is seal in that cover soil on top of that seed. In much the same way that when we transplanted, we watered in, the watering settled all the little soil particles around the root hairs. Well, here what we're doing is actually settling in the soil directly around the seed. We're sealing that seed with soil particles and water, and that's what it needs to come alive in germination. You just want to sprinkle the surface a little bit. When it starts to puddle up, that's when you move on. Now, you don't have to go this way. You can go long ways if you want. The trick is to spread the water on as evenly as you can. Remember, like the compost, corners and edges. If you take care of the edges and the corners, the middle will take care of itself. So always do a couple extra passes right along the edge of the bed. Especially the south and western edges, because they dry up because of their exposure to the sun. All right, now we've done everything we possibly can do to get these seeds off to a good start. Now we have to do what farmers and gardeners have been doing for centuries. We just have to wait.